Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Church Creatives Club podcast. This episode is going to be a little bit different as I do not have somebody that I'm interviewing this time around. Just going to be a little bit different. Had some scheduling conflicts come up, but plenty more interviews will be coming up, I promise. But I wanted to take some time and do maybe I guess we could call it a little tutorial episode, because I realized that while there are a lot of bigger churches that have full creative teams, they have people on staff, photographers, video guys, graphics guys, or they have the budget to sub this out to professionals. That's not the majority of churches, especially in America. I forget what the statistics are, but the majority of churches in America are like 150 members or less. And so what happens is a lot of people that are producing graphics and creative content for churches really are just kind of learning as they go. They're not professionals. They are probably not, probably don't have degrees. They haven't been to school. They're it's like, hey, I know how to use Canva, or I can figure out Canva. I can make some graphics. I have a camera. I like photography as a hobby. I'm going to jump in there and try to get started on that. And so I've had a lot of people reach out about that. And one question that I get over and over, and one thing that I see people really struggle with, is file types, especially with graphics and photography. It can get really confusing, and there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of opinions. People are going to tell you, everything always needs to be a PNG, everything needs to be a JPEG, and everything needs to be this certain resolution. Everybody kind of has their own preferred ways of doing things as well. But I want to kind of just give you some of my personal experience on this and really explain some things. So if you're the kind of person where you've heard vector graphic and you have no idea what that is, or you've heard, what is a SVG? What is an EPS file? What do I need to submit for printing? This is the episode for you. Now, if you are a real tech person and you like real technical explanations, this episode is not for you. In fact, you're free to listen, leave me all the hateful comments you want about how I explained something wrong. I am going to give simple explanations in this episode. I am going to give explanations for the people that have no idea what I am talking about before we get started. So let's jump in. This episode is for you. Hopefully you will find something interesting out of it. Hopefully it will help you out. Like I said, because I have a real burden for helping the small churches. And, look, I was in the same boat. I am on staff at my church now. I am very blessed to be a part of it. I'm very blessed to have a career in graphics and creative work. But I started out just doing stuff in the church, had no idea what I was doing, but I knew there was a need for it. And this is kind of all the stuff I have learned on my own. I don't have any kind of formal education. Everything I know, I have learned from just doing it, from asking questions and watching a lot of YouTube videos. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now, the first thing that we have to establish is there's two main types of files. You have raster images and you have vector images. Okay. We have to establish what each of those are before anything else makes sense. Raster images, and again, I'm not going to give technical explanations. I'm going to give the easy to understand explanations. Raster images are anything that is pixel based. So the best way to think about this, if you take an image, you put it on your computer, put it on your phone, whatever, and you zoom in, you start to see the pixels. It gets pixelated. Or let's say you take a really small image. Everybody has probably encountered this. You have a real low resolution image. You try to blow it up and it looks all blurry. It looks all pixelated. That means it is a pixel based image. Okay. A vector graphic, on the other hand, is not pixel based. In fact, the easiest way to explain it is it's a mathematical equation. What I mean by that, if you take let's say you take a 2-inch by 2-inch square that is a raster image and you try to make that 20 inches by 20 inches square, it's going to be very blurry, very pixelated, not going to be usable. Let's say you take a vector file with a 2-inch by 2-inch square and you want to blow that up to 20 inches by 20 inches, your software, I'm going to be using Adobe Illustrator as an example. That's my go-to vector editing software. When you blow that up to 20 inches by 20 inches, on the back end, it's doing some mathematical formulas to put everything in place so that that image looks perfect no matter how big it is. This is why people always stress logos, things that are logos, icons, things that are very important of that nature that get used from really small all the way to giant print things need to be vector based, because you can resize them, I guess, pretty much infinitely. Yeah, infinitely. That's the word I was looking for. So I'm sure there probably is a limitation as far as hardware. But if your logo is vector based, you can put it on a business card and it looks crisp and clean, or you can blow it up as big as a billboard and it still looks pixel perfect. So now that we have established you have two types of images, raster images, which are pixel based, vector images, which are mathematical based. Now within that, there are pros and cons to each one. Like I just established, with vectors, you can enlarge them however you want. The problem is they do not have as much detail. What I mean by that is take like a photograph, okay? If I take the camera that I'm filming with and I put it in photo mode and I take a picture and it comes out at 4,000 pixels by 4,000 pixels wide or something like that, it's going to have a lot of detail in there. It's probably going to be like a 25 megabyte file, lots of detail. I can get that printed pretty large. You can enlarge that pretty big. But there's going to be, thousands and thousands of colors in it. It's just going to, all those, each individual pixels capturing information. It's going to be very, very detailed. Now, with a vector image, I can't take that photograph and make it into a vector because of all the different colors, all the different lines, all the different shapes. It's just, I guess technically you probably could convert it into a vector, but it would be such a huge file type. So with raster-based images, you can take a photograph, something that has a ton of information, get it compressed down, and have a small file size, okay? Now, the downside is all that information, if you need to make it big, your file size grows with that. So if I take a picture that's 4,000 pixels wide versus a picture that's 8,000 pixel wide, it's going to pretty much double the file size. Now with a vector, because it is using a mathematical formula, the file sizes are actually very small. You can design a logo, blow it up huge in Adobe Illustrator, and it still be less than a megabyte file, depending on how many colors, shapes, how in depth it is. So that's one of the advantages of that. So when you're designing graphics and things like that, you're pretty much going to do all that in raster images. If you've got a lot of textures, layers, colors, transparency layers, all these different effects on that, that's pretty much always going to be a raster-based image. When you're designing logos and things that have shapes and illustrations and stuff like that, you're going to want those in a vector graphic. And especially if it's something that is going to be printed across a wide range of mediums, it needs to be upsized, downsized, stretched, whatever, want that in a vector based. Now, the different file types within that, you have a bunch of different extensions. We'll just label them by extension. There's a bunch of different extensions in raster images and vector images. For raster images, you've probably seen the real common ones. GIF is one, GIF, JPEGs, JPEG, JPG. I think there's even a JPG 2000. There's a couple of different JPEG compressions. PNG is another popular one. Let's see, PSD files. So if you have a Photoshop file, that is going to be a raster image. So no matter what people tell you, even though Photoshop has some vector capabilities, PSD files are not vector based. Okay. Design your logos in Illustrator or something vector based, or if you have to do it in Photoshop, get somebody to convert it into a true vector. BMPs, you don't see BMPs a whole lot unless you're getting into photography. A lot of people may save photos that they're going to print, like really high quality prints. Sometimes we use BMPs, less compression than a JPEG, but still raster based. On vectors, you're going to see extensions such as AI, which is an Adobe Illustrator file, EPS, SVG, PDF, although I will make a note about PDF. Just because PDF can be a vector does not always mean it is a vector. I'll explain that in a little bit. And there's a couple of other vector-based ones. I'm drawing a blank here. The most popular vectors you're going to see are going to be PDF, EPS, and AI and SVG. SVG is mostly used in web-based. You'll see a lot of icons, a lot of logos, pretty much anything like that that's being used on a website now. A lot of people do those in SVG because, like I said, they can be scaled. So whether you're viewing it on a large screen or a phone, it always looks the same. For print shops, the print shops I've always used usually either want a PDF that is actually truly vector or an Illustrator file or an EPS. Those are kind of the go-to vectors. All right, so let's talk about the difference between these files when you want to use them, their use case, and the pros and cons of each one. On the graphic side, pretty much every graphic you make, whether you're posting it on social media, whether you're getting business cards printed, just graphics in general, especially in church, always going to be a JPEG or a PNG. That's usually everything you're going to see, unless you're doing an animation, unless you're doing a GIF, an animated GIF. Otherwise, everything is going to be JPEG or PNG. Now, let's establish some differences between JPEGs and PNGs. And I know people are already going to say, you're wrong, because everybody has personal opinions about which one to use in which type. JPEGs are usually my go-to. The reason being is the compression on JPEGs is pretty good now, especially when posting to social media. It does, especially if you're using Photoshop, for example, and you save it as a like 10, 11, or 12, when you go and export it out, it'll ask you the quality. 10 and above, going to be very, very good quality as long as it's the right resolution. If you're putting something on a screen that's 1920 by 1080 pixels, if you make your JPEG 1920 by 1080 pixels, save it at the maximum quality, it's going to look good. File size is going to be low because of the compression. PNGs, on the other hand, are going to be not compressed. They're not compressed. So you would automatically think, well, maybe they look better. And in some cases they do, but PNGs are really for digital use only. Another advantage of PNGs is the transparency. So you see this a lot when you're putting a logo on something that's digital, not going to be printed, even if it's a really high quality PNG, like a black or a white version of your logo, people will use that to be printed. They just don't scale like a vector graphic, but they're transparent. You cannot get transparency out of a JPEG. Okay. So keep that in mind. If you need it to be transparent on the background, always use a PNG. Now, this is where the debate comes in about JPEGs versus PNGs and which ones to use. What a lot of people do not realize is that PNGs, since they're basically for digital use, do not support CYMK color schemes. If you don't know the difference between CYMK and RGB, RGB is typically used for digital. That's the colors. RGB is red, green, blue. CYMK is typically used for printing. Cyan, magenta, key, CYMK, and yellow. Almost forgot yellow. CYMK. Okay, JPEGs will support CYMK. This is why if you design a graphic in a JPEG at the right size with CYMK, you can send that and get printed and it will look good if it's set up right. So keep that in mind. If you have something that is CYMK, and you will notice this a lot. I have had people design something, send it to me, and then want to know why the colors look off. Well, they sent it in a PNG, but it was a CYMK color scheme in Photoshop that they were using, or CYMK color mode, and it's really noticeable like on phones. They text me an image and the colors are just way off, and it's because it's trying to take the CYMK and convert that into RGB. So keep that in mind, that if you were designing something in CYMK, it's not going to look right with a PNG. The other thing I have run into with PNGs, especially in iPhones, and some people have encountered this as well. It's not just isolated. Sometimes iPhones don't handle PNG graphics very well. I don't know what it is. I don't have the technical know-how, but I have just had PNGs that were transparent. Then all of a sudden iPhones decide they're not going to be transparent anymore, or the color schemes, it gets messed up. They just don't look right. I design everything as a JPEG unless it needs transparency. Then I will do PNGs. I know some people design all their graphics, export them as PNG. That's fine. I prefer the JPEGs because the file size is a whole lot smaller. It's a lot easier to manage. And I have actually been doing some experiments on my own, very non-scientific experiments. But if you look on my ARcreates Instagram and the Church Creatives Club Instagram, I have been alternating between JPEGs and PNGs just to test it out, and nobody can tell the difference. Once Instagram gets a hold of your image and it goes through their algorithms and their compression and all of that, it's going to be what it's going to be. I don't care if you use a PNG or a JPEG. Some people will swear they're getting different results. Me personally, I cannot scroll through either of my Instagram feeds and determine which one was a PNG or which one was a JPEG. So take that with what you will. Maybe somebody else has a different answer for that, but I just prefer JPEGs. I encountered something where, and this is what I'm talking about, file size. We were hosting a conference at our church, and the people that were coming in sent us their graphics in huge PNG files for some reason. Like our screens we designed, ours is actually a 16 by 10 screen, not a 16 by 9 screen. So it's 1920 by 1200, I think, is our resolution. Well, they doubled that resolution and then saved it as a PNG. And so now I've got graphics to put on my screen, and they're so big they couldn't be emailed. They're 14 or 15 megabytes a piece or something like that. Whereas typically when I design something for the screen on our church at 1920 by 1200, save it as a JPEG, even maximum quality, it's usually 2 megabytes or less. So if you're generating a lot of graphics, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using JPEGs. Now, moving over to the vector side, usually everything I send off to be printed, I do as a PDF, with the exception of the screen print shop that I use. They always request an Adobe Illustrator file. That's what they use for all of their printing needs. They use Adobe Illustrator to set up their files to print for screens. And so by sending them an Adobe Illustrator file, it's easy for them to just go in and edit it. In fact, a lot of print shops will accept JPEGs or PNGs, but what they don't tell you is they're converting that to a vector graphic, and a lot of print shops will actually charge you a fee for that conversion. So usually if you can provide them with a quality vector graphic on the front end, it can even save you some money when doing screen printing. And I was talking a little bit about the PDFs. A PDF does not automatically make something a vector. This is a very common misconception that I see, especially sometimes I will ask people, hey, I need a vector graphic. Do you have a vector of your logo? Because I'm trying to design you some banners. And they're like, yeah, will a PDF work? Absolutely. Send me the PDF. Well, I get the PDF, and all they have done is opened up Photoshop, dropped a PNG into Photoshop, and then saved it as a PDF. Or even worse, they've dropped a JPEG, which is not transparent, into Photoshop, saved it as a PDF. That is not a vector. You need to, in that case, you would actually have to put it into Illustrator, put your PNG to Illustrator, trace it out, and then save that as a true vector graphic PDF. So hopefully all of that, it's not an overload of information. Hopefully that has cleared some things up. Leave me some questions, comments. You can send me a message if something was not very clear. I'm not going to really get into resolutions and DPI or PPI and print quality versus digital quality, all that kind of stuff. I just really wanted to kind of give some people an explanation of different file types, when to use them. And real quick, I want to touch on photography for just a minute. Okay. Most of the time in photography, you will hear about what is called raw files. Okay. your any DSLR out there, any mirrorless camera now has the ability to shoot in JPEG or RAW or both. JPEG plus RAW is usually what it's labeled as. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to both, and I want to kind of clarify that and maybe help some beginner photographers out. JPEGs, like I said, are compressed, and in the photography world, they call it the settings are baked in. Now, what I mean by that is going back to like our example of JPEGs with graphics. It's got all these colors, it's got all these shadows, layers, whatever. Well, when you take a picture with your camera and it puts it into a JPEG, when it comes out and you put it on your computer, it's ready to go. Now, you can still edit it, you can still brighten, darken, do whatever, but those settings are those settings. Typically, how it looks on your screen on the camera after you take a picture is how it's going to look on the screen on your computer. It is done. And JPEG files are a lot smaller. Now, this is why I always suggest people shoot RAW files, okay? When you shoot a RAW file, your computer or your camera, the computer inside your camera is capturing all of the data, how bright it is, what are the colors, this and that, and it is saving them, very similar to a vector graphic. It's kind of like a mathematical formula is a way to think about it. It's saving them, and then when you put that onto a computer and open that up in editing software, you are able to change a whole bunch of stuff. Like I can go back and change the white balance. I can weigh up the shadows. It's a lot more forgiving to shoot RAW files. The downside to a RAW file, however, is the files are very, very large. And they need to be edited, okay? What you see on the screen of your camera after taking a picture with a RAW file is the edited interpretation of what your camera sees. So your camera is saying, I think the photo looks like this, but this is just kind of what I think because it's a RAW file and I'm only capturing the data. I'm not actually editing. So a lot of times when you open up a RAW file on your computer, it's going to look very muted. It's not going to look near as good as it did on the camera screen because your camera is applying some edits to what it thinks it should look like. So if you do shoot RAW, remember that you do need to edit those images. Even if it's just slight edits, you need to edit them. But I always recommend, again, shoot in RAW, edit it, then export it out as a JPEG, and you'll have a lot more freedom to edit, a lot more options. You can recover dark images a lot, which we know lighting is always the number one thing people struggle with when shooting photos in churches. So hope that clarifies some things. Hope that helped you out. Like I said, leave some comments, ask questions. Let me know everything that I said wrong, and I'll try to correct it on the next episode. But I will see you guys later. Stay tuned. More episodes are coming out later in the year. I'm shooting for maybe one every 2 weeks. I would like to get to the point where we're releasing a podcast episode every week. Also, if you know somebody, if you have somebody you would like to hear, somebody that is a church creative, maybe they shoot video, photography, graphics, even musicians, songwriters, whatever. If you know somebody that you think would make a great guest on the Church Creatives Club podcast, please get them in contact with me. Tell them, send me a DM. Let's set something up. I want to hear from you guys. I want to make this a community effort. Talk to you guys later. Can't wait for the next episode.